Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a really powerful historical analysis of that critical year right before the Korean War. It was a time filled not with peace, but with these unseen conflicts, covert operations, and some really tragic choices that set the stage for one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. The source we're exploring today kicks off with this very question. It frames the whole path to war, not as just some simple timeline of events, but as this complex story of fate, free will, and ultimately, catastrophic failure.
So our story, it doesn't actually begin in 1950. We have to go back 5 years earlier, to 1945. For Koreans, the end of World War II should have been this amazing moment, liberation from decades of brutal colonial rule. But that moment of triumph was immediately overshadowed by a decision made thousands of miles away.
What happened was, the peninsula got sliced in two right along the 38th parallel. It was just a line drawn on a map by foreign powers, creating two opposing zones, a Soviet-backed north and a US-backed south. And this division, which so many Korean independence leaders had feared for years, well, it created the perfect fault line for a whole new kind of conflict.
Right at the center of this struggle for unity, you've got this absolutely towering and, in the end, tragic figure, the veteran independence activist Kim Gu. This was a man who had dedicated his entire life to one dream, a free, single Korean nation.
I mean, just listen to that. That statement really captures his absolute resolve. See, against the advice of pretty much all his supporters who thought it was totally futile, he traveled to Pyeongchang in April 1948. It was this desperate last-ditch effort to try and find a peaceful unification with the North.
But, and this is the really tragic part, the source portrays his noble effort as just doomed. The whole conference was a carefully staged piece of political theater, used by Kim Il-sung to create this facade of legitimacy. Kim Gu, this revered patriot, was reduced to a prop. His dream was crushed by the cold, hard realities of the new Cold War, and his assassination a year later, well, it marked the death of that dream for an entire generation.
Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. The central argument in this analysis is that a brutal, undeclared war was already being fought on the peninsula long before the first tanks ever crossed the 38th parallel. This was a war of infiltration, of subversion.
And the text uses this fascinating analogy to explain it, Heinrich's Law. It's actually a principle from industrial safety that says, for every one major accident, you'll find there were 29 minor incidents and about 300 near misses or warnings. In this view, the Korean War was that one major catastrophe, and it was preceded by hundreds of warnings.
And the main weapon in this shadow war was something called a phroxia. Now, these weren't just your typical spies gathering intelligence. No. These were agents of chaos, whose whole mission was to embed themselves deep inside an enemy's institutions and just tear them down from the inside. And this whole strategy just blew up into the open with this one shocking event that the source calls the National Assembly Phroxia incident. It was a plot that shook the brand new South Korean state to its absolute core, revealing just how successful and how deep the North's infiltration campaign had already become. So get this wasn't just espionage. It was this incredibly sophisticated attempt to use the South's own democratic legislature against itself. The goal was to pass a resolution forcing a U.S. withdrawal, which would remove the South's only real military shield, leaving it completely vulnerable to an invasion.
Now, let's see how this internal subversion was made even more dangerous by what was happening on the world stage. Because remember that plot to oust the U.S. military? Well, it failed. But then, believe it or not, the U.S. decided to leave anyway.
As the source lays it all out, this sequence of events was just catastrophic for the South. First, the last American combat troops packed up and left, leaving only a tiny advisory group behind. Then, just 6 months after that, the U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, gives a speech that basically draws a line in the sand for America's defense in the Pacific, and South Korea was on the wrong side of it.
And this just perfectly illustrates the massive strategic vacuum that opened up. I mean, on one side, you've got a North Korean army being pumped full of weapons by the Soviet Union and backed by Communist China. And on the other side, a brand new South Korean state, now diplomatically isolated and totally outmatched militarily. This was a seriously dangerous imbalance of power.
So with the military advantage now decisively in their favor, the North's public strategy did a complete 180 in this very calculated, very cynical way.
This was the final act of deception. The source describes how, at the same time the troops and tanks were secretly massing at the border, Pyongyang started broadcasting all these messages of peaceful unification and reconciliation. They were proposing conferences, exchanges,
The whole 9 yards.
It was a masterful psychological operation, right? It was designed to lull the South, and maybe more importantly, the rest of the world, into a false sense of security. So while all these messages of peace filled the airwaves, the final secret preparations for D-Day were being completed.
And that was it. The stage was finally set. The South had been hollowed out from the inside, isolated by geopolitics, disarmed by this huge military imbalance, and then, finally, deceived by a phony peace offensive. The invasion was no longer a question of if, but when.
And so we end right back where we began. The source really forces us to ask, was this war an unavoidable destiny, just a cursed fate for a divided nation? Or was it a preventable catastrophe, one that was born from a collective failure to read the 300 warnings, the 29 incidents that all pointed to the single devastating tragedy to come?